Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. It's part 2 of this Gauntlet mini-series. Welcome to the Gauntlet. In the last episode we took a look back at the game that started it all, Gauntlet, arriving on various microcomputers and 8-bit systems of the day. If you missed it, I highly recommend watching part 1 before continuing on the quest today. Today we're taking a look at the next game in the classic era, Gauntlet II. By 1986, Gauntlet fever was still going strong. Gamers couldn't get enough of that dungeon crawling action. However, 8-bit was so 1985. It was now 1986, and newer hardware such as the Commodore Amiga had found its way into our homes. Atari was poised to follow up on one of their all-time greats. What had been a game that had achieved a monster success was now to become a series that would become a legendary success. Gamers ran out to the shops on launch day and had Gauntlet 2 on pre-order. With the newer hardware and a promise of a huge sequel, we ever so slowly and quietly sat in front of our computers to see what all the fuss was about. Gamers hadn't even passed the intro screen, and yet we already knew that this was a moment in gaming history that many of us share to this day. The music, now one of gaming's most recognisable tunes. The graphics, so colourful, and the announcer clearer than ever. This new Gauntlet really struck a chord with gamers. It was everything we loved about the original, yet it was more refined, more detailed, and more fiendish than ever. In particular, I find the sound design of Gauntlet 2 to be very haunting and memorable. The magical whir as you exit a level. The sound of an unlocked door. The terror of the sound of death sucking at your life force. And of course, the sound when you pick up a key. Just as music or smell can take you back to a place in time, it's the sound effects in Gauntlet 2 that personally take me back to the 1980s and my first experience with gaming. With full 8-way directional movement, scrolling, invisible walls, magic walls and new pickups, Gauntlet 2 expanded the series into new territory. It was simply great fun to play and hours of value as you and 3 friends tried to beat the Gauntlet. Now, there aren't many editions of the game available. Most will be in small plastic cases, however there are some decent variants to chase down if you are a Gauntlet collector. Of course, there were a multitude of home conversions of the game. I'd like to show you 2 major releases here, the NES edition and the Commodore Amiga version. Starting with the NES version, we see some really decent artwork that builds on the first NES release. Of course, the packaging also displays screenshots of the game within, and the box contains those all-important manuals and rather slick cartridge. It's the front of the box though that gives us the most exciting features. 4-player action. Yes, that's right, a true 4-player game on the NES with the use of the multi-tap port. What a time to be alive if you were a NES owner. How about this though? Remember in part 1 we covered how Tengen was created as a subsidiary of Atari Games Division to enable them to release on home consoles. Well, Tengen is now nowhere to be seen. In fact, Mindscape had now been given the publishing rights by Atari. Perhaps to some Nintendo fans' disappointment, in the last episode I suggested how US Gold's conversion of the original game to the Sega Master System was an overall better offering in terms of presentation and gameplay, whilst the Tengen published NES version was somewhat lacking. Somewhat of an embarrassment to Atari, who held the licensing for the game, who trusted Tengen as its subsidiary to deliver. For Gauntlet 2 though, the tables were flipped. The Sega Master System never received an official release of Gauntlet 2, whilst the NES edition was released to great success. It's fair to say that this time round, Gauntlet 2 looks really great running on the NES, and proved that it wasn't the hardware restrictions that limited the NES, it was the development of Gauntlet 1 that held it back. Personally, I think Mindscape's Gauntlet 2 looks great on the NES. Some good detail in the sprites, and even the sound effects have been given a bit of care and attention to emulate the feel of the arcade. There's now smooth scrolling, and the colour palette, although not arcade perfect, does justice to the system. Side by side, there's a cohesive feeling to the artwork despite the swap in publisher. This feels like a series despite the earlier licensing issues. Where things go a bit awry is in some of the detail. For the longest time, the 4 colours of the heroes have played such a key element of the game. Having a blue wizard, warrior and Valkyrie on the title screen is just unforgivable. At least Questa the elf is still green. However, speech is back. Yes, the narrator will introduce your character and comment during the gameplay. For NES owners, this must have felt very satisfying to know that such important Gauntlet elements were now back in the game.
Welcome, Red Warrior. Red Warrior now has the second shot.
For microcomputer owners, there was a lot to smile about too when it came to physical presentation. The Spectrum 128K edition of the game is surprisingly good, featuring the game's main enemy, the dragon. The internal instruction sheets are spot on when it comes to functionality and branding. And I dare say that the Spectrum edition also plays reasonably competently as well. It's now very cheap to pick up, so I definitely recommend this edition to those of you out there that want a real retro feeling experience. As mentioned earlier, the Sega Master System did not see a release of Gauntlet 2. Instead, US Gold worked on a number of other ports, but in particular the edition of the game that would become known to many, including myself, as the definitive Gauntlet 2 home release. Enter the next-gen consoles in the way of Commodore's Amiga. The great grey box of unrelenting power, Gauntlet was about to go into overdrive with the help of Commodore. The speech? Excellent.
Welcome to Valkyrie.
The levels? Huge. The gameplay? Tight. This simply was the full arcade experience in your own home, and hands down one of US Gold's crowning glories. Gauntlet 2 for the Commodore Amiga was actually the first Gauntlet game I played outside of the original arcade machine, and it was a fantastic experience. That fun of running through the levels, not getting mobbed by hordes of enemies, running away from death. Simply put, it's a classic formula with brilliant execution. You can place this game in front of a child or adult all these years later, and it's as good as the day it was released, which for me defines what a timeless classic should be. Of course I do enjoy the NES box artwork, however it's the Commodore Amiga big box first pressing that really gets my collecting habit excited. I have to say, it still gives me joy to own a first pressing of the big box edition. For collectors, this simply is the definitive conversion in many respects. With the artwork in line with the original Atari concepts, this box now screams nostalgia, with the dragon at the heart of the Gauntlet now taking centre stage. It's also amusing to see the back of the cover depicting the heroes facing an unknown evil together, except for the elf who's just doing his own thing. Inside you get the thrill of owning the original disc and the wonderful paperwork with the original Atari illustrations. For any serious Gauntlet series collector, this is definitely one of the highlights in a historical sense. US Gold and Atari really did get their act together and deliver a game that worked on so many levels for so many age groups. In truth, Gauntlet 2 plays in a very similar way to the first game, however there are some important additions in the way of extra pickups. Items such as Reflective Shot meant that you could now bounce your projectiles around corners. The It curse made every monster in the Gauntlet follow you until you collided with another player to pass on the curse. In addition, floor switches would now open up certain areas, secret rooms were added, invisible walls, new enemies. This was Gauntlet on steroids. Everything about the Gauntlet experience had been lifted up a level, and had created a genuine step up in gameplay experience. With its iconic top-down dungeon crawling format, cast of interesting protagonists, Gauntlet II is still to this day regarded as a best-in-class game of its type. This is certainly one of my go-to games when I'm asked what the Diablo of its day was. Gauntlet II kept gamers busy for some time, and that's a good thing, as we wouldn't see another entry in the series, other than the Deeper Dungeons, until 1990. Even then, this is not going to go the way you think, as it was an exclusive title for Atari's own handheld device, the Atari Lynx. Join me in the next episode as the quest continues in Gauntlet, the third encounter. The quest continues.